Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Last time we talked about the end of the Cold War and a changing economy, and today we are finishing Unit 9 by talking about migration and immigration in the 1990s and 2000s and the challenges of the 21st century. These are your last notes in AP US History. So if you are ready, let's begin. First thing we're going to talk about is migration. So, migration is people moving within the United States. And the important area that we need to think about is this area in the South and the West is pictured in red here on this map. Do you remember the name of this area? We've talked about it before. It's the Sun Belt. Okay. And so, as more people move to the Sun Belt, the influence of the Sun Belt is going to increase politically, economically, and culturally. As more people move there, it means there's going to be more money to be had there. When there's more money to be had there, more job opportunities means more people are going to move there, and it's kind of this repeating cycle. And as more people move there, there's going to be more representation for these states in the House of Representatives, in the Electoral College, and that's going to mean more power to these Sun Belt states. Let's shift gears and talk a little bit about immigration now. Immigration is the movement of people into America from other countries, and the major areas that are going to increase during the 90s and 2000s is going to be immigrants from Latin America and Asia. These were traditionally underrepresented groups in America, and a lot of this has to do with the 1965 Immigration Act, which removes a lot of the restrictions on immigration from these areas. This in the 2000s as seen by many people as a way to help supply the U.S. with a labor force. And we can see in this graph how the number of immigrants is steadily rising and rising and rising over time. And again, at this time in the 90s, 2000s, this is mostly supported by people because of these immigrants' participation in the labor force. Now, changing topics to talk about terrorism and the military, the first thing we need to understand is this event called 9/11 and the attacks on 9/11. You've probably heard about this before, but Al Qaeda, a terrorist group from the Middle East, leads an attack on the United States. They hijack planes. They send some planes to the World Trade Center in New York, to the Pentagon, and then one crashes in a field in Pennsylvania. And this changes life forever inside of America. And in terms of the military, this is going to launch one invasion of a country called Afghanistan, which is a Middle Eastern country. And this is a response to the Taliban, a terrorist group, holding Osama bin Laden, who was responsible, kind of the planner behind 9/11, or was thought to be the planner behind 9/11. Okay, this is a very lengthy conflict. America's trying to find terrorists in Afghanistan, and it goes all the way through the 2000s and the 2010s. It just recently was stopped. American troops just recently were withdrawn by Joe Biden. There's another conflict going on in the Middle East at the time in a country called Iraq. Now, the U.S. had a history of invading Iraq. The U.S. actually invaded Iraq in 1991 under George H.W. Bush. They didn't invade Iraq, I should say, but they stopped Iraq from invading a neighboring country called Kuwait, and then the U.S. stopped from going into Iraq. Well, then in the 2000s under George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush, the U.S. starts to get concerned about the leader of Iraq named Saddam Hussein. We suspected that he had these things called weapons of mass destruction. WMDs is the term they used at the time. And we thought that he had chemical weapons. We thought that he was maybe building nuclear weapons and that there was connections to terrorism. So we invaded Iraq to try to bring peace to the region and the area. He did not have any nuclear weapons. No nuclear weapons were found. However, America does end up taking over Iraq, trying to put in a democratically elected government in Iraq. So let's talk now about how this terrorism has impacted America inside America as opposed to in foreign policy. So after 9/11, life changes, and one of the big focuses for the government and concerns for people is security. And there's a large push to try to improve the security of people living in the United States. That's a really important concept. Bold that, highlight that. However, we also need to know once they start to increase the security of people in the United States, it's going to raise the debates about, well, how much government interference is too much? Is it getting in the way of people's freedoms, of people's civil liberties, of their human rights? And that starts to become a debate that people have. So this is a really important law to be aware of. It's called the Patriot Act, and this is a law that's passed in the 2000s, and it increases the power of the federal government to wiretap without a warrant. It brings in this idea called a roving wiretap, where now the government could say if they suspect you of being a terrorist, they could have a warrant to wiretap you, the person. So they can wiretap any device that you're using, any phone that you're using, anything. It's instead of just having to get a warrant for each device. So this makes it easier for the government to basically listen in and figure out what different people are doing inside of America. And some people are concerned about that. And then there's another individual to be aware of. His name is Edward Snowden, and he was working for the government. He basically exposes and leaks out a lot of information about what the government is doing to have mass surveillance against their own people. Okay. And so Edward Snowden ends up having to kind of flee to Europe to try to escape prosecution. But again, he's exposing these ideas of, is the US government's are they infringing on people's civil liberties in the sake of security? Is this a good or a bad thing? All right, completely shifting topics now to the environment. Environmental issues become a big deal in the 2000s and 2010s. There's massive debates over the use of fossil fuels and the environmental impact of using those fossil fuels. One of the ideas related to this is the conflicts that are going on in the Middle East, either the first Gulf War or the second Gulf War. A lot of people were suspicious that America was doing this for alternative reasons, that they wanted to secure rights to oil fields in the Middle East. And there's also a ton of concerns about climate change in general. And there's a famous film that comes out by Al Gore, who's pictured here on the right. Al Gore was the vice president to Bill Clinton and tries to become president in 2000, but doesn't win. And he creates this movie called An Inconvenient Truth, and it talks about the dangers of rising sea levels, and it talks about the dangers of climate change, and it was very impactful on a lot of people at the time. So with climate change, we've seen the push for the green energy movement, more solar panels, more wind power farms. We've seen the push for electric cars. We've seen people get more and more concerned over the environment. The last idea to talk about is this thought of the U.S. as a superpower. And College Board wants one of the main ideas for the 90s and 2000s that the U.S. is going to continue as the world's leading superpower despite growing economic and foreign policy challenges. The U.S. has the largest military budget. You can see that picture here on the right. This is, I think, from the early 2010s or 2000s. But the idea is that the U.S. spends so much money on their military. The U.S. spends more money on the military than the next 7 countries combined. The U.S. also has a massive economy, and that economy has global reach, and a lot of the decisions that the U.S. makes affects a lot of other countries. So the U.S. is still seen as the leading superpower, although more recently we see China becoming a major rival and Russia becoming a major rival, kind of as Russia always has been. All right, so that is it for our notes on migration and immigration in the 1990s and 2000s and the challenges of the 21st century. Let's do our big ideas before we get too excited. Number 1, discuss migration and immigration in the 90s and 2000s. Be specific. Number 2, how did the war on terrorism affect American rights? And number 3, what is the role of the U.S. in the world as of the 2000s? And what is the context for that idea? So that is it for our notes on this lesson and for all of AP US history. You made it. Very proud of you. Thank you so much for watching.